Of a new book by David Taylor called Open and Unafraid, The Psalms as a Guide to Life. More about that in a minute. My name is Ewan Russell-Jones, and this event is brought to you by the bookstore of Regent College, Vancouver, where I teach. Regent College is a graduate school of theology, and the bookstore is an integral part of its mission to cultivate intelligent, vigorous, and joyful commitment to Jesus Christ, his church, and his world. The college and the bookstore are physically closed at the moment because of the pandemic, but we're still very much alive and kicking and trying to be intelligent and vigorous and joyful in new and creative ways. It's great to welcome David Taylor for this virtual book launch today. David is no stranger to Regent. He was a student here himself at one point. Maybe we'll talk about that later on. He's now a professor of theology and culture at Fuller Theological Seminary. And he's the author of a number of books on Christianity and the arts in particular, including The Theatre of God's Glory, Calvin, Creation, and the Liturgical Arts, and more recently, Glimpses of the New Creation, Worship, and the Formative Power of the Arts. But this new book, Open and Unafraid, focuses on the Psalms of the Old Testament. It's got a foreword by the late Eugene Peterson, and an afterword by Bono of U2, so two rock stars, a rock star of theology and a rock star. Strikes me a rather fine company to be keeping. You'll find more details about the book and how to get a copy on our YouTube page. And if you've got a question for David, please email it to bookstore@regent-college.edu. You'll see that address there as well. Questions to bookstore@regent-college.edu, and we'll try and include some of those questions in the conversation. So David, many congratulations on the new book. Seems to be a kind of slightly different to some of the other things you've written, because it does focus so strongly on the Bible. How did this come about?
Well, it came about, I wouldn't say through happenstance, but I had not anticipated writing this book, if I'm honest. But after the short film came out with Bono and Eugene, I found myself in frequent conversation with folks personally and in public spaces on the Psalms. And so I began to acquire a small library of resources on the Psalms. And then I discovered a gap in the literature, which surprised me. On the one side, you have this wonderful, wonderful collection of scholarly resources on the Psalms. And on the other, you have this wonderful collection of what I might call daily devotionals. So let's say Eugene Peterson has his, Timothy and Kathy Keller have that one. They're wonderful. They're really, really quite delightful and helpful in so many ways. But there wasn't much in the middle, what I would call meaty but accessible, or substantial and practical, as it were. And I found myself somewhat keen to recommend books to folks. And folks would ask me, where would I start? And I could send them in the direction of an introduction, basic introduction. There are many really good introductions to it. But I kept looking for something that would be perhaps more than just a straightforward introduction, something that would capture their imagination. And one day I thought to myself, perhaps I could write it, but not as a scholar. I'm not an Old Testament scholar. I'm not a biblical scholar, but I put my pastor hat on, and I thought I could write it in that mode, addressing folks in our communities, lay folks, and help them to capture a vision for the life that the Psalms would present to us. And Psalm 1 begins with this use of the language of the way. And in that biblical world, way language is wisdom language. It's an active faith. It's a faith that is walked. And so it's a cue to the reader that the next 150 poems are a path that you walk, and the path takes you through a landscape that involves every dimension of human life. And it's as if the Psalms are this invitation to walk on the way in prayerful, worshipful ways. So you walk life in other dimensions, but this is the way that takes you through every aspect of human life, but prayed. And so that's why I ended up focused on focusing on themes, very specific themes that I felt captured sort of the essence of the Psalms, but also captured a lot of the fundamental aspects of our human life. And so that's why it's a thematic approach rather than an introduction.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, as you said, you're very well aware of the number of books that have been written about the Psalms through history, really, isn't it? Some incredible, So you're up against some competition. It's an intensely personal book as well, isn't it?
Right.
You've obviously read all of these commentaries, but there's something deeply personal about what you're doing here.
Well, I mean, one of the things that you discover when you begin reading the literature on the Psalms is that many, I don't know if I would say the best, but perhaps the most memorable or the most popular in the sense that they're most widely known are the ones that have a personal dimension to them. So I just have sort of examples here. Bonhoeffer's very famous Psalms, the prayer book of the Bible, written mid-20th century, not long before he's hung to death. Thomas Merton's little book, Praying the Psalms, is personal. Even Athanasius's little book, as it were, that sort of in our world is usually tucked at the back of his book on the Incarnation, is addressed to a very personal circumstance. And so I think I initially was drawn to the Psalms for very personal reasons, and I wanted readers to discover themselves, their own personal stories, as it were, represented and played out in the Psalms. And so I felt like I wanted to perhaps give permission by modeling what it meant to, well, as the title of the book says, open and unafraid. And the basic argument that I make in the book is that the Psalms, as it were, are this devotional and liturgical antidote to our primordial sin, which is to run away and hide from God and to shut down and shut off from others. And that is our human predicament, is wanting to run away and hide and wanting to close ourselves off. And the Psalms are this gift, this help, this prying open, but a very gentle, even if perhaps persuasive way of remaining open. And what does it mean to remain open if you don't choose to be personal? Because our lives are all very idiosyncratic in a sense. We have rather distinctive characteristics to our lives that name us and identify us, and that name our history. And so I guess I found myself in that tradition of writing on the Psalms, and hope that it might provide an easy on-ramp for folks to enter in themselves.
I mean, you draw attention to the fact that historically the Psalms have played a massive role, haven't they, in the life of the church, certainly in people's personal devotions, but very much in terms of the worship and everything of the church. And yet, it seems like in the modern era, they've been neglected. Now, why do you think that is? Well, so why now do you think is a moment for the Psalms to be heard?
Gosh, that is a really good question. I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I'm not a historian, but I'll maybe say a couple of things. You're right to say that, I don't know, maybe the last 300 years, it's hard to make a generalization because there are pockets of the global church that have made more of the Psalms than otherwise. But I guess one of the things that I did discover in reading is that we are the exception. We in the contemporary, say, 20th, 21st century, we're the exception in terms of how the church has historically approached the Psalms and felt it to be a normative, comprehensive part of what it means to be shaped in prayer and in worship. So the onus is on us why we don't make more of it, or why we only make piecemeal work of it. A lot of our hymnody, a lot of our songs have pieces of it, but rarely do we make much of the wholes of Psalms or sort of movements within the Psalms. And certainly liturgical traditions, if we want to put it in those terms, Episcopal, Anglican, Lutheran, would have a regular reading of the Psalms, but that's no guarantee that there will be homilies or sermons or expositions on the Psalms. And so we may hear it on a regular basis, but have no real sense of its meaning for us today. But I think you may say that with the liturgical renewal movement of the early 20th century, you have this long arc of a recovery
So you explore lots of different themes from the Psalms in the book, but you begin with a chapter on honesty. And it seems like that's a real focus for you about what the Psalms have to offer us. Do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, if I'm honest, I didn't steal, but I was inspired by a title to a book by Walter Brueggemann, the Old Testament scholar, who's the maven of Psalm scholars in this era, written prolifically. And there's a collection of his essays that was put together pretty recently, and the title of it was "From Whom No Secrets Are Hid," which is from the Anglican Collect for Purity, as Anglicans well know. And his introduction to the collection was to make a case that would describe the entire Psalter, is this invitation to tell our secrets to God and to tell our secrets to the people of God. And so that captured my imagination, and it provided a little bit of a lens to reread all the literature that I had read, and then to reread the Psalms, and then to think to myself, I think he's onto something, which is why we landed on the title of the book, Open and Unafraid. But I also use language of vulnerability, because I do think you see that virtue, that disposition played out all throughout the Psalms, which again, I think goes back to perhaps my reading of the fall. Is the result of the fall is this anti-vulnerability inertia. We're hiding, masking, protecting, walling up, and calcifying, hardening. All these sort of images or metaphors describe the effects of sin in our lives and in the brokenness of our worlds. And the Psalms are working against the grain of this broken inertia in our worlds, and inviting us to be vulnerable. Or as Bono put it, and I really love the way he redefined, or at least he defined vulnerability as being porous. And I like that. Our skin is semi-porous. Our whole bodies are semi-porous. So it's this capacity to let in while we retain our integrity. And it just captured my imagination. And I felt like it was not an imposition on the Psalms, but sort of an induction, saying, I think that's what the Psalms are on about, amongst other things, of course. But I start with honesty, but then I pair it with community, as if to say, you can't be this vulnerability by yourself. You need a community to bear it with you. And then the rest of the book goes from there.
Yeah, so that Anglican prayer starts as Almighty God, unto whom all hearts are open.
Yes.
From whom no desires it.
Yes,
so that openness that you're talking about is an openness to God, certainly. But as the next chapter is actually on community. And it does seem like you really you're addressing something here that is very contemporary. You say that there's no such thing as a modern individualist in the Psalms. It's fundamentally a communal book. That's pretty uncomfortable, isn't it?
Well, David Ford, the British theologian, has this bit in one of his books where he describes what he calls the hospitable first person that you discover in the Psalms. And so the point being, the Psalms are very, very personal, but in saying that, we're sort of avoiding two perhaps extremes. One is that it's, say, utterly idiosyncratic, but on the other hand, that it's individualist, which may be the same, to say the same thing. So it's personal, and we can recognize that personalness, but it doesn't devolve to idiosyncrasies or to this private, autonomous experience, which unfortunately has marked how Christians have read the Psalms for many years, and perhaps Protestants in particular. So I love this idea of a hospitable first person. So it's very personal, but it's capacious, or a capacious hospitality, as it will, that invites all persons into it. But I guess for theological reasons, as you and I well know, our personhood is established, constituted in community. And so I do think you see this interplay between the one and the many in a psalmic key, as it were. And I think it's beautiful. I think that's why any Christian in any era of history has been able to resonate and find themselves, again, represented in some fashion. But unfortunately, evangelicalism, perhaps in particular, has tended to want to privatize the Psalms. And I'll just say, maybe real quickly, that's unfortunately how many have read Psalm 23, perhaps especially in American evangelicalism. And a point I make very briefly here, but I make elsewhere, is that we're wrong to read Psalm 23 by itself, that Psalm 23 is very much in dialogue with Psalm 22 and Psalm 24, both of which are set within these large communal settings. And so it's, in a sense, the Psalms are wanting us to hear this interplay, this little auditory integral relationship between Psalms. And if you understand that Psalm 23 is set between these two Psalms, then it, in a sense, rescues you from devolving to this privatized reading of it. And you realize there's something really quite fantastic happening in the statement, "The Lord is my shepherd," which in ancient Near Eastern societies at the time, that phrase would have largely have been rendered, "The Lord is our shepherd." And so something really unusual is happening for the Jewish reader to say, "The Lord is my shepherd," in a sense, perhaps to protect from the dangers of a collectivist, the dissolving of the person into this generic whole. And you understand those things, then I think it just becomes such a rich reading of the text, and it does become me within the context of us, or you and y'all, together.
Yeah, I mean, how far do you take this this public confessional aspect of it? Because that idea of our hearts being open to God and
Right.
no secrets being hidden from God. There are some secrets probably not only that we are deeply ashamed,
Right.
but we
Sure.
we couldn't dive.
Yes.
How far does this become? Well, actually, you could imagine some situations in which, rather than it being a kind of thing against modern individualism, it actually stokes modern individualism by kind of, we spill our guts out
Yes.
in public, and it becomes actually not helpful to the community.
Right. I mean, you could say that's at worst the cult of authenticity, right, of the last 30 years. To be authentic is to just air it all out, let it all out. I mean, the only thing I'll say about that is context, as Gordon Fee would tell his students in New Testament. But that context is also cultural. Different cultures will render vulnerability differently, or what seems or is deemed to be appropriate transparency or vulnerability. But I think each culture may also have these fallen dimensions that sort of pull it in one direction away from health over another. So, some things are appropriate in conversation with the pastor. Some things are appropriate for a conversation with friends, in the therapist's office, at the police station, and in corporate worship. And I think that requires discernment, wisdom. It's a communal discernment. It's a leadership discernment. But I think there's a way in which, those of us who are in leadership may lead by example, by again, appropriate. Well, it's just different for every culture, what's felt to be appropriate, but still sort of these appropriate moments of transparency where we can say, in humility, I too need the grace of God, perhaps in these specific ways. And I think the Psalms are nudging us in those directions.
Okay, thank you, David. We'll continue this in a moment. Just a reminder, folks, if you're watching and you'd like to ask a question to David about this book on the Psalms, or about any of his other stuff, actually. Maybe a little bit more about how all this relates to the arts a little bit later on. But you can email your question to bookstore@regent-college.edu. So there are other themes that you explore, and again, they're very, very personal things about honesty, sadness, disappointment with God. I mean, the things that happen to us in our lives, and there's a lot of really powerful stuff there. But you've got a very strong chapter on anger, which you kind of see as playing a serious role in the Psalms. And let's be honest, this is one of the reasons why actually some people are quite embarrassed by aspects of the Psalms, where you read about, smite my enemies, oh God, come and do them in for me, smash their children's heads against the rocks.
Right.
This kind of this is difficult stuff to read out in church, let alone to pray seriously yourself. And yet you don't want to flinch from that. You want to say, no, we got to do this. We got to confront this stuff.
Yeah. Well, yeah, soberly and with humility, we approach the curse Psalms. Historically, the church, for example, has loved the first two parts of Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept, so on and so forth. Not the last third, right? The dashing of the babies against the rocks. So the first two have made their way into church hymnody, into prayers, into preaching, into a lot of art. But that last has been largely excised from our liturgical and prayer devotional lives. And I guess I would say, understandably, how exactly are we to do that at all? Or well? I think some of it really is an exegetical and theological issue. How much of the Psalms needs to remain back in Israel's era, and we don't transfer or translate it into the New Testament era or New Covenantal era? I think those are fair questions. On the other hand, I try to make a case, and I'm not the only one. I do lean on a lot of the work of Miroslav Volf on this question of the curse Psalms, and Walter Brueggemann as well, both of whom say anger left untreated becomes toxic. And that toxicity becomes destructive, self-destructive, destructive to those who are near us, destructive to others on a more social, political, public stage. And in a sense, anger is simply a very acute form of sadness. So if you bump your knee up against your desk, that's a moment of getting hurt, right? And you exclaim. But if you do that for the 8th time because your other knee has been giving you trouble, chronic pain, and you're frustrated with that, exasperated, and so this experience of continued weakness that then results in a repeated injury, that then sort of this amplified experience of pain is what we might call anger. And you can be angry at the desk, you can be angry at yourself, you can be angry at a doctor in this case, or at God. And I think what the Psalms are doing is providing us a grammar for anger, to set it in this liturgical sphere, so that as Miroslav Volf says, our rage can be brought before the face of God. And that's in a sense to say that our humanity can be brought before the face of God. And I find that persuasive. How do we do that well in worship settings? I'm not quite sure. A lot of congregations are thinking this through even today. We wouldn't do it lightly, but neither would I want to argue that we, pull a Thomas Jefferson and cut up the Psalms and get rid of all the imprecatories and say only the nice things. And the argument I make is that the Psalms are inviting us to bring all the things into the presence of God. And sort of the image I had with these Psalms of anger is, I have a toddler son, he's 3, and sometimes he gets very upset for reasons that he's not aware, but he's just beside himself, and he'll grab me by the lapels, by my shirt, and it's just sort of this forceful, fearful sadness, sense of disorientation, and he's letting it all out in my face, but he's not letting go. And he knows that I will not let go of him. And I feel like I think that's the picture of what the Psalms are inviting us to do, is to take these deep, deep experiences of our losses, our pain, our suffering, and there are many, and certainly the global church may understand these perhaps better than those of us in the West in some ways, but mental health, emotional health, abuse, that is a universal thing. And the Psalms are saying, here is language to give expression to your unedited emotions, to your incoherent, raging thoughts. And I think that is the gift, to put us into this space where, again, rather than taking it out on someone close by or self-sabotaging, we can give God the finger, as it were, by damaging ourselves or rerouting it and then being destructive in a public sphere. Psalms are saying, bring it to the face of God. And it's not easy, but what a gift, I think. What a gift to us.
I mean, interesting, you quoted Jefferson there, and he's a kind of deist, really, and was quite happy to get rid of stuff from the Bible that was uncomfortable. But even somebody like C.S. Lewis,
sure,
in the 20th century, says better to leave these things. You quote this in the book, and
right.
And there is something about your argument seems to be we need to articulate our anger. But the trouble with that is we've become used in the 20th century, haven't we, to the whole notion of hate speech. We don't want certain things to be said,
right,
and for certain people to be referred to in particular ways, because it actually encourages our anger. It encourages resentment. And it does seem to be that kind of encouragement to certainly view our enemies in a particularly nasty way here. How can one really say this is legitimate for us to do when Jesus says, love your enemies, do good to those who curse you? And here we are cursing. The implication is we're cursing our enemies.
Right. Yeah. Fair enough. I mean, that's what my first response is. Absolutely. I get it. And somebody asked me one time, I was giving a talk on the Psalms of Enemies, which I have a chapter on, the whole question of enemies. And as Eugene Peterson has written about it quite extensively himself, as well as others. Somebody asked me, what's to keep people who are now given permission to pray these curse psalms in worship, what's to keep it from stoking their own vengeful passions, to imagine this political party or that political party or that part of the church or a spouse, and I thought to myself, nothing. In a sense, it's a risk. The moment you give permission to the people of God to put on their lips these words, it is a risk. However, in the same way that the Psalms are an ecology to themselves, and they're all performing this, in American terms, multiple branches of government, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, sort of these checks and balances on each other within the Psalms, even within Psalm 139, which everyone loves. You've knit me in my mother's womb. These thoughts are too amazing. And then you get to the very end and you get some serious revenge language happening. So, and a lot of lectionaries cut that stuff out. They stop short of it. And I think biblical scholars and Psalm scholars, and I make a short point of this, is to say, you can't take it out because it's there for a reason, because it is ligamented to these other things. And so if we see that the Psalms are an ecology, the Psalms themselves are in this larger ecology of the writings and the Torah, and then for us as Christians in this larger canon. And again, as Bonhoeffer himself has said when he wrote on this, don't dare put those words on your lips if you have not reckoned with your wretched, broken, sinful, vengeful self before the cross. Until you've done that work, you have no right to put it on your own lips. Also, it'll be the end of you if you do it, because you don't have the right moxie. You don't have virtue inside of you. You don't have that disposition of humility that would safeguard sort of this internal Holy Spirit sort of empowered check on these vain imaginations. And so I think that's the thing that Christians throughout history who have chosen to give permission to the church to say these words have said yes, but they come in concert with preaching and with praying and singing and acts of reconciliation and confession of sin and acts of mission and love of neighbor and love of enemy. Mm-hmm. So it's very difficult to entertain these revenge fantasies if you are doing the good but very difficult work of loving your neighbor who happens to be your enemy, or you experience them as an enemy. So in isolation, dangerous. But I think the Psalms and good pastoral practice would say, not alone.
Now, I'm not giving any of your secrets away, because you've actually written very personally in this book. And one of the things you talk about is your own problems with anger.
Yeah.
Throughout your life. So how have the Psalms helped you personally to deal with anger management?
Yeah, I know, anger management. Well, I argue that they don't do anger management. They do anger sanctification, which is not quite the same thing, even if there's a Venn diagram. Yeah, anger kind of runs in our family generationally. I didn't really manifest it when I was a young person. It was when I got to university, to college. Have enough life experiences that are difficult or that wound you, and then you access these parts of your personality or genetic code that you didn't realize were there. And when I was in college or university, I remember walking around University of Texas campus with the sound of the growl of a wolf in my head, sort of this simmering anger. I was ready to pounce. Anybody who said something wrong, I was ready to put them in their place. And those closest to me, family and friends, took the brunt of this part. I was able to manage my public perception with beyond that immediate circle. But I remember when our daughter was born, and this was after experiences of miscarriage, which very painful. I remember driving around the city of Durham, North Carolina. She was in the back in the baby carrier, baby seat. And I felt so deeply grateful, but also the precariousness of her life. Like I could lose her, like we'd already lost so much. And I had this little tape, cassette tape for those of us of a certain vintage, running through my head of somebody coming to the car and like threatening us in some way. And I would pull out a baseball bat, which I didn't own, and beating them to the ground. Just sort of this rage inside out of this fear, right, that I would lose again. And I thought, something's wrong with me. Like, I don't think this is very healthy. and so, again, a combination of pastoral care and therapy and friendships and prayer were all part of God's work. But the Psalms, this is one of the things I never really noticed these until I really started to reckon, sort of this sense of feeling like something was really broken inside of me and I needed help. And if I didn't get help, my wife and children would be the ones on my off days to experience it, which I did not want that to happen. So I began praying the Psalms, what I call Psalms of anger. And what, biblical scholars and others have written on this is praying these things is a way to rescue us from enacting them. So it really, like a lot of psychologists talk about,
a way of rescuing us from enacting them. From enacting
them, yes. So I say it.
Fulfillments.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So it's almost like a bloodletting or a purging. And I think a lot of psychologists and therapists might do practices like this. Like, hey, I see that you're feeling upset. Tell me how you really feel. And so there's this eruption, and it's almost a sense of like, whew, I got that toxic out of me. Now, then still hard work of healing. And it's like physical therapy. It's not an idea or an insight or a moment. It's a lot of work of doing the same series of exercises, but in this case, maybe spiritual and relational exercises to get to the place where one would experience healing. But saying out loud these things is a way, I guess, for this for the real you to show up, so that the real you can get healed, rather than the one that you would like to continue to have others perceive of you. And then this is the one that we feel guilty or ashamed of, or afraid or embarrassed, or whatever it is that we may feel as broken creatures. But for me, anger was this, this thing that I had to deal with. So, yeah.
We'll come back to some more of the themes in a minute. But Eugene Peterson is all over this book. I mean, he wrote the foreword, but you quote him regularly, including the message, of course. I mean, his versions, his translations of various scripture passages, but especially the Psalms. Tell us about you begin actually with the story of being in Eugene's class on the Psalms. So tell us about his influence on you, on your thinking.
Yeah, well, my second year of seminary, I took a course with him. I write about this in the book. It was called Biblical Spirituality. There's this vision of the Christian life that you might discover from a certain reading, like a spiritual theology reading of scripture. But he would include, poetry and history and theology and literature. And hey, the man had this comprehensive library inside his own head. It was spellbinding. But he never told us once how we could go live this thing out. And so, the last day of class, at the end, I thought, that guy's going to leave us. He's going to give us nothing. And I was young, and I was an impatient young man. And so I raised my hand. It's like, please, just one thing. So he thought about it, and his answer was, tomorrow read Psalm 1, the next day read Psalm 2, get to the end and start over, and that's it. Off he went. And I understand, in your sense that he did have this profound allergy to the how-to or self-help, in as much as those approaches to Christian faith might excuse you from the hard, slow work of reading scripture and prayer and all these other things that he felt were basic to our life. And simply to go find a book that says, you do these 4 things and you'll be okay. He felt like that did greater damage. So he erred on this one side. So, fair enough. He's a man. He's just a man. But such a lovely man, too, and so gentle and generous. And I just felt like he, all the things that many of us love about him, his ability to tell good stories, his ability to take his time, his ability to take us out into creation and to attend to those rhythms and to read the old books, some of the new books, how very personal he was with us. Those are gifts that remain with me. And of course, his smile is such a generous, he was so at home in himself, in his own bones. And I think that certainly was my first and last impression of him. And I thought, I want to be like that, at home in your own skin. And when Bono marches, onto his doorstep, Eugene is tickled by the whole thing. And he's like, this is he gets a kick out of it. But he's not overawed, not because he's too cool for Bono, just because it's here's a man, I'm a man, you're my wife, you're this person, here we are. and that certainly put Bono at kind of at rest, because he himself was, I think, a little bit nervous. So those things about Eugene are just such lovely things.
So you were obviously, going back a few years, you made this film with Eugene and Bono, about the Psalms. You know,
Mm-hmm.
now,
Yeah.
were you already working on the book? Do you already have the idea?
No,
for the book, or did somehow
no.
you know, to come out of that project?
Yeah, the book was not an idea. The project itself, again, I don't normally think of pulling two people like this together. It was something that came to me, I guess you could say, on a providential whim. And originally it was to be a public event, like a conference. Like one day, I'd imagine a one-day conference on the Psalms, and then they would be the marquee event. But U2, the band, was in the middle of rehearsals for their tour, the Songs of Experience tour, I think. And they were in Vancouver at the time. And it was just extraordinarily difficult to find one day that they both could do. It was mainly Bono's schedule. But then the one day I was on the phone with folks from Ireland the whole time, that Bono was free. I called Eugene, and I think his son was having surgery. And so Eugene was like, I'm so sorry, I can't. And I thought, that's it. You know, the project, you know, it was a good idea, but nothing will come from it. But my friend Steve Purcell, who also went to Regent and is the director of the Lady Lodge, he pitched the idea. He said, well, what if you reconceived it as a film thing? And so that was a wonderful idea. And so I ran with it, and lo and behold, we did it April 19th, 2015. So essentially 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And Bono flew down from Vancouver, and we flew up from Texas and filmed. Had about 3 hours. And Bono's request to me in advance was that he would get 1 hour with Eugene and Jan first, just to have a personal conversation.
Yeah.
And so it was a really beautiful thing to see that kind of exchange.
And he's written the afterword for this book. Loved the title, Open and Unafraid.
He did.
Which, you know, he feels like nails what the Psalms are all about. And yet there's a complaint in it, not about you, and he loves, loves what you've done here. But you know, why isn't the church more like, why isn't the songs that we sing in church more like this? Has he got a point?
Well, yes, but with an asterisk. Bono told me, so his own words, that his parish is the whole crew that goes with him on these tours. And his church is the world, in a sense. And that's fine. You know, that he feels like that's where God has called him to do his work. So I wouldn't say there is a parish church, you know, that maybe he attends regularly. Maybe there is, you know, where he lives in Ireland. But I think he has a memory of certain things that stay with him about his experience at church, that, you know, to use the English novelist Susan Howitch's titles, Glittering Images and Glamorous Powers. He saw a lot of that, and that always frustrated him. So he's always been drawn to the Psalms because he perceives from beginning to end, and certainly in King David, sort of this letting it all out. You know, not hiding, but being brutally honest. So he loves that language of honesty. He loves the Psalms for that reason. And he has been just exasperated with some of his experiences. But the truth also, just to be fair to others, is there are many churches, and I think there are many artists and many musicians who have been writing very frank, honest, self-disclosing work. He's just not aware of it. So when the film came out, that was the title, you know, that a lot of articles and magazines, you know, ran with. Why can't the church be honest? and then I had a lot of musicians I did not know from Adam get mad at me, you know. I was like, hey, I didn't say that. We're kind of like, hey, we're doing it. I'm like, I know, but he just doesn't know you. But, you know, I think, yes, there still are churches that would struggle and would want a very well manicured storefront, and I do think that goes straight against, you know, the vision of a human life that we find in the Psalms. So
you mentioned obviously the fact that Bono's interested in this. You know, there's clearly an appeal to the arts and to artists very much here. And historically, the Psalms have been this tremendous source, haven't they, of inspiration for artists. They're poems, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
You quote a lot of poems. Why is poetry important to us theologically? What does poetry matter in the life of the church?
Well, many other rather smart folks have written about this at length. And I took advantage of all their work because, like many who are not poets, it's easy to find poetry intimidating or difficult to navigate or perhaps off-putting. But I think the thing that was such a wonderful discovery in reading on poetry and biblical poetry and poetry in the Psalms is the generous spirited nature of poetry in the Psalms, that it really is this accessible language to all of us, in as much as, I'll just sort of draw attention to two things. Poetry accents the musicality of language. And I think, scientists and philosophers have written about how our brains and our social attunement has a musical quality to it, that we attune ourselves to one another through how things appear pleasant to our minds and to our bodies. And I think there's just, Dr. Seuss's fantastic, playfulness with language and the sounds of language, and children love it. Unfortunately, we get to a certain age, we think, oh, we're too big or too old to read these books, and I think that's a terrible loss. But poetry is everywhere. All songs, all popular songs have some poetic dimension to it. We love how words work together, play with each other, sound together. And so there's the aesthetic delight as an aspect of God's shalom. That's something Calvin Cerebral writes about a lot. I love that idea, that aesthetic delight is central to the shalom of God's good world. But the other thing that poetry does is it traffics in images and metaphors. And one of the arguments that I make, because I do have a chapter on poetry to help people say, what's going on here, is, let's say Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. If God had wanted to say, I'm a really good caretaker of people, well, that could have been stated. But it wasn't. It was, the Lord is my shepherd, which is a metaphor. Is God a Tunisian goat herd? No. Is he an Australian sheep herder? No. So the question is, what is it that a metaphor like the Lord's my shepherd affords us in terms of a way of knowing the world, knowing God, being in the world? And so you realize, well, metaphors include a whole sort of series of things inside. It's like this conglomerate of associations and meanings that point in all kinds of direction to, the prophets who have been shepherds in some way, the priests who are supposed to be shepherds, the king is supposed to be a shepherd, shepherds themselves and socioeconomic, arrangements of the society, the provision that shepherds offer, the danger that they experience. In other ancient Near Eastern societies, there's a ruthlessness in the way that shepherds behave themselves, in which princes or kings would then treat their subjects as vassals. And so there's a lot going on in this phrase, the Lord is my shepherd, and the reader, a good reader, would hear all of those associations. So the idea that I argue, and I think others do as well, is that the true knowledge of God, and therefore the true love of God, drives straight through the metaphor, not around it or beyond it. And you see that Jesus, of course, every reference to himself, or at least 9 out of 10 references to himself, are metaphors. Mm. And again, if he wanted to say, hey, I'm a pretty good highway, like you can count, it's pretty straight, he would have said that. But he said, I'm the way, I'm the door, I'm the light, I'm the bread, I'm the lamb. And every one of those statements exists within this historical, cultural context where the original hearers they're hearing all these things happening, and new things are also appearing. And you see that all the way to the end of the book of Revelation. Metaphor. So metaphor is what I guess the point I make is, metaphor is figurative language that enables us to figure things out in the world that we could not figure out otherwise. There is no other way. Prose could never do the job just as well or just as truly.
Yeah. So there's so many wonderful settings of the Psalms, aren't they, done by composers, still happening. I mean, Arvo Pärt doing great, beautiful work based on the Psalms, and James Macmillan and others. One of my favorites is Brahms, How Lovely Is Thy Dwelling Place, Psalm 84. Right. Have you got a favorite musical?
I mean, I will say, Arva Parrots de Profundis, it's a keeper. It's a really good Holy Week standby. Out of the depths I cry unto you. But I mean, just to move away from the classical musical world, which I do love. My mother was a concert pianist, so we heard lots of classical music growing up, and we still do. But just two things that maybe at a more popular level. Sandra McCracken is a singer-songwriter, folk musician based out of Nashville. Made an album a few years ago on the Psalms. It's so many of the songs there are sung in churches today. She just has such a gift with lyrics and with music and capturing the Psalms in a way that make us want to sing it in fresh ways. I love the work that she's been doing. A second, which I'll mention, which, some people may raise their eyebrows, but Kanye West, his song Jesus Walks, samples Psalm 23 as a way to reconceive life in America in the face of violence, which I think is a very Kanye thing to do, to take the Lord to my shepherd. But you do have the specter of enemies and evil in that psalm. So it's not all domesticity. It's not all pastoral. There's some darkness, on the corners or really at the table or on the other side of the table. I love sort of how a lot of hip hop artists have worked with the Psalms, because they hear themselves, in that language. And even the Rastafarian band, the Melodians, reworked Psalm 137 as a way to say, we understand what exile is from the inside. This is our song. And so I find myself gravitating those directions because I enjoy it, but I also find myself challenged by the music.
Great. Now, we've talked a lot about the kind of personal dimensions of the Psalms, and that is certainly a strong theme in the book. But you also draw attention very strongly to the global vision of the Psalms. The creation themes and justice and the nations. And I think that is something you definitely want to see kind of explored and emphasized, as they are in the Psalms. It's not, you don't have to look just to the prophets to find out about social justice.
Right.
In the Psalms that really that shows God's heart for all that.
Yeah, well, I grew up in a tradition. I cannot remember a single prayer prayed about justice. I cannot remember a single sermon on justice. Justice is what the Roman Catholics did. I was raised in Guatemala. Roman Catholics did that. Liberation, theologians did justice, and liberal Protestants did justice. And so I think I was malnourished in my childhood and young adult years. And so I sat down to write this chapter on the Psalms of Justice. And honestly, I was intimidated because I'm not one of those, justice activists. I want to be more attuned to those things, but gosh, I think there are folks that are much better fitted to write this, but I thought I have to write this. I mean, I cannot write a book on the Psalms and leave that aside. And it was a very stimulating, very sobering, but wonderfully eye-opening. And I got to the end and I felt like I had experienced genuine transformation. And I thought, I want to live differently. I want to teach differently. I want to be a different kind of pastor and preacher in light of the comprehensive way in which justice appears in the Psalms. And as if to say, there is no faithful prayer or worship that leaves justice aside. So if you don't like the term social justice, if you don't like the way that X group talks about it, fine. Do a deep dive in the Psalms and, draw out your own conclusions. You might land in a very similar place, but I won't tell you that. And Wolterstorff, the philosopher, Nicholas Wolterstorff, talks about what he calls the quartet of the vulnerable. Which at the top of my head,
isn't it? Beautiful.
Yeah. So the orphan, the widow,
the alien,
the needy, and I think the oppressed or the exile. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Poor and the alien.
The poor and needy. Yeah. And I love that phrase, the quartet of the vulnerable. And then you realize it in the New Testament, it expands. It's not a quartet, it's an octet. And I thought, let's, all my wonderful conservative friends who love Scripture, the authority of Scripture, the inerrancy, the infallibility, whatever word you want to choose, we want to be biblical. I say, then be biblical. Take these texts seriously. You'll have to reckon with justice, you'll reckon with the nations, and you'll reckon with creation and the mess that we've made of it. And God will judge us because he tells us we will be judged by how we fail to care for his earth.
So we can't finish this at this moment in time without asking you about the pandemic. I mean, do you feel like there are Psalms? Do you think there are the kind of dimensions of the Psalms that really have got something to say to us at this moment?
I do. I mean, I wrote a song. I wrote lyrics to a song, and a friend of mine wrote music, and I called it a bedtime story for a bedtime song for anxious children. In the first 2-3 weeks, I began to hear from my friends who have children how anxious children were becoming, experiencing anxiety in a way that they had never experienced, and it made me very sad and sort of concerned that this would kind of create this trauma, for months and years to come. And so I thought maybe if they had something to sing, and so I basically rewrote Psalm 23 in one sense, and then wrote a series of prayers along the themes of anxiety for children. But I personally have found myself drawn to Psalm 4 and 5, which are called an evening and morning song because I felt my own anxiety, and I go to bed and just churning away. I wake up and I'm churning, and I thought I need something to help me go into rest, a true rest, a trustful rest, and then to arise in a place of trustful, peaceful, a state in my heart, rather than all the who knows what's going to happen, what new news and what greater terrors, will stalk us in the darkness or the darkness of the day. So I feel like that psalm, a lot of people have been struggling with sleep. So that pair of psalms, I think the fact that we're facing death more up close, perhaps, than we have, maybe we normally do. Psalm 88, 89, that pairing of psalms might be helpful for us to name death faithfully, name depression faithfully, name darkness faithfully. Psalm 90, 91, sort of this affirmation of God is our refuge. Are you? Where are you? So is it an assertion of fact, or are we stumbling in the direction of trusting that the Lord is our refuge? So I think some of those things, might be helpful for us. And I do have this, chapter on what I call the Psalms of death. And, one of the things I suggest is we may not be talking about death faithfully. We may be talking, as Christians, we may be talking about death actually looks very little in the ways that, all of Holy Scripture talks about it. And we may need to stare more clear-eyed into the face of death and ask ourselves, how do we feel about our mortality? How do we feel about an untimely death? And when someone dies, how do we talk about their lives in a way that doesn't Photoshop it, but in ways that names it truthfully, with all the brokenness and maybe all the good things as well. So I don't know, whatever else has resulted from this pandemic, I hope it has made us more humble, more sober, more sort of sensing our interdependence. And the Psalms can provide us this common speech to bring us into the common space so that we don't feel that we are utterly alone.
Well, thanks, David. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for a beautiful book and best wishes with it. Thanks to you, our audience, for joining us as we talk about this. You can get hold of the book through the link on the YouTube page. David, you have something else to say?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to mention this. My wife and I mentioned this to you yesterday, but we created a series of prayer cards.
Beautiful.
So that individuals and families could pray. So we took all the themes of the chapters in the book, and then she illustrated them. So I'll just do them real quick. These are all the ones, all the things. That's anger. That's joy. That's enemies. Justice, death, nations. I love creation. Look at that. I'm 148. So on and so forth. So you can get them at the Rabbit Room store. So if you just Google Rabbit Room, the Rabbit Room, and their store, they're the ones that are selling it. But it was just sort of this practical, handy aid. Kids can look at the pictures and have conversations. Adults can also look at the pictures and have conversation. But just a way to provide a visual, accessible, aid to prayer.
And the book does have, at the end, each chapter ends with a series of questions and kind of suggestions as to how you can take this on in a group, in discussion. And that's very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. The book is available. It's Open and Unafraid, the Psalms as a Guide to Life, published by Nelson Books. As I say, the link is there on the YouTube page. Thanks for joining us. We'll do this again sometime. Many thanks.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Ewan, and thanks to Bill, the owner.
Bill Reimer.
Just such a beautiful man. I've loved your work all these years, and thanks to everybody.
Good stuff. Thank you very much indeed.